Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this 2 hour A World Awakening / Soul School Sojourn hybrid episode. So honored. I suppose as we were getting ready to come on tonight, I was like, well, Rupert, when Andrea's not able to be on, you often take the reins of A World Awakening. When she's not able to be on Soul School, I typically host it solo or with a guest. And I was actually thinking as the show was getting ready to start, we didn't really discuss who was going to intro, but so I was like, well, I guess I'll just say something. But welcome to the show tonight, everybody. As you probably heard, Miss Carolyn Perrin, the matriarch of the Perrin family, has, let's just say, entered into actual reality and but has left this present plane of existence. And so, of course, Andrea and her family are together and doing what one does in these situations. And so, obviously, she's not here to join us tonight, but Rupert and I kind of conferred with one another, and we didn't want it to be on her mind that it was a replay, because she's a very conscientious individual and loves and cares for you all so deeply. And when she's not able to be here with you, she feels that. And I don't want to say it bothers her, but it does bother her. And so we wanted her to be able to focus solely on what she needs to focus on tonight. And so here we are. We will try, the three of us males, to make up for that one very strong, powerful female presence that is Andrea Perrin. And I don't think we'll probably succeed in that, but we'll do our best. But welcome to the show, guys. For those of you who have been on, many of you will know Aaron. I don't know, because this is actually A World Awakening and not Soul School. So I know there's a different audience for each show. So Aaron's never been on A World Awakening, but he has been on Soul School with me several times. So some of you may know him, some of you may not. But Aaron's a friend of mine. He's an ex-pastor, a spiritual teacher, a mental health professional, and just an all-around amazing dude. And I asked him to join us for this conversation tonight because I really thought it would just be, I thought it would be very edifying, and we could all, I don't know, see what happens. But tonight we do want to all send our thoughts and our prayers and whatever it is that you do in whatever belief system you have. We want to send it all to Andrea and the Perrin family tonight, and just let them know that that we love them. We're thinking about them, and our hearts and our prayers are with you guys. So I don't know, gentlemen, do either of you want to say anything just by way of introduction before we kind of launch into the conversation tonight?
I think you've done a good job there of introducing things. I've been in touch with Andrea over the last few days. Got a message from her just an hour or two ago. It's hard. It's a hard time for her, but they have seen this coming, and her mother has had a very, very full and exceptional life. And she knows, and I know, that that her mother is is still conscious, is still alive, is still out there, wherever people like to believe they are, but she's still there. And so Andrea is pushing forwards, and I'm certain that it won't be too long before she will be back on this show. So we'll send our best wishes to her.
Yes, absolutely. And she will, I'm sure, at some point read these comments on this video. And so if you want to drop your condolences and your thoughts and your prayers here, that would be a good way of reaching her with them. So I would be remiss if I didn't say, even though it's A World Awakening, it is kind of our tradition on Soul School, which that is the technical hour we're in, to say classes in session. So in Andrea's absence, I will say classes in session tonight, whilst the world is awakening, I suppose. So those two things can go hand in hand. Well, guys, we talked a little bit, and we kind of planned in the spirit of, at least I know Andrea and I show, I'm not sure exactly how it always goes on A World Awakening, but our pre-show meetings usually consist of a few texts of, hey, what do you want to talk about? How about this? Sounds good to me. And then we roll with it. And we never have a difficult time coming up with stuff to talk about, because we're all kind of on the same wavelength, even if we come from maybe different schools of thought here and there. But I threw something out to you guys today that has been kind of rattling around in my mind and in my brain for the last, well, I mean, it's something that's always rattling around in my brain and mind, because this is just a thought that's important to me. But really, as of late, I've been thinking about, and those of you who have watched the show before and heard me will likely have heard me talk about this before. But I felt to talk tonight about the concept of logos. And then as we move into the second hour, we're going to talk more about the particularities of good and evil and right and wrong, and how it is we conceptualize these things. And I kind of have a feeling these subjects are really going to kind of mold and mesh into one another and kind of naturally flow. But I was thinking about the idea of logos. And for those of you who might not know what that is, and guys, I'll just set the thoughts up and then let's just go for it. I don't want to be a mic hog here in any way, shape, or form. But I can be. So if I'm talking too long, grab the metaphorical cane and pull me off the stage, please. But I just wanted to kind of set the stage, and then we'll kind of tease the conversation out. But so I was thinking about the concept of logos, Logos. And for those who might not know what that is, if you come from a church background, you might recognize that term from Scripture, from John chapter 1, verse 1. That says, in the beginning was the Word, or the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. If you're not, you might just be familiar with the term and not know what it means. But logos is a Greek philosophical term, a Greek philosophical term that comes from pre-Socratic tradition. And it specifically comes to us from the fragmented works of the philosopher Heraclitus, or Heraclitus, however it is one pronounces that or chooses to pronounce it. And the idea of logos is it's something like what a friend of mine, a theologian, Michael Hardin, calls the structuring principle of reality. That logos is the skeletal structure of reality itself, and it is therefore why reality is shaped the way that it's shaped. So, like, if you're thinking in terms of a glove, okay, the hand would be the logos. The glove is the reality that wraps itself around it, and it's shaped the way that it's shaped because the logos underneath is shaped that way. And so initially you may just drape cloth over the hand, but then it begins to cling to it and takes the form of a glove, and then we develop the idea of glove to cover hand. But hand predates glove, so hand would be logos, glove would be something like a system we build around it to accommodate it. So logos would be like what you believe lies at the center of reality, whatever that is, right? So if one's a Christian, one believes, God is creator, Jesus, the Trinity, depending on what kind of Christian one is, that's what lies at the center of reality. If one is more a, just into, consciousness and, let's say, idealism, there might be some kind of divine consciousness that's sort of observing us all into being at the heart of all reality. But there's some kind of logos. There's some kind of, turtles all the way down, if you will, original fractal from which everything sort of balloons outward, and reality is shaped the way it's shaped because there is this center that begets the rest of us. And so obviously then it's important what you believe the logos is, because whatever you believe that center principle is how you're going to structure reality. Like, you're going to mirror the rest of reality as far as it's within your power to create it. You're going to mirror it after what you believe is the truest reality, right? If that makes sense. And so for Heraclitus, or Heraclitus, he put forth the idea, and I'm no pre-Socratic scholar, but in my very basic understanding of Heraclitus, you can probably hear these frogs going to town outside of my window here, guys.
Oh, is that what it is? I was wondering who was heavy breathing in the background.
Those are frogs. It's about that time of night where they engage in whatever it is they're doing out there. But I say they're recording content for their Only Frogs channel. So unfortunately, I don't get any of the royalties for that. But so Anyways, logos, not frogs. So that idea is like, okay, so Heraclitus's idea was that everything comes in pairs and they're opposing pairs, right? That there's everything has its opposite, right? So they would think in terms of male and female would be opposite, night and day. In a more ancient mind, they would even think in terms of a ruling class, and then they would even think in terms of a slave class. Obviously, we don't think like that, but ancient peoples would have. They would have thought people of different bloodlines and different, they're different. That's how they thought of it. And so everything comes in pairs. And then the idea is that they merge into oneness by virtue of the logos. The logos is the thing that pulls them together into oneness somehow. It's the thing that takes all that is and brings it together. And the question is, how does it bring it together? And that's the important part. For Heraclitus, it was violence that brought them together. He said that Homer, not of the Simpsons, but of the Iliad, was wrong when he wrote, would that war would cease between gods and men, for war and violence is what gives everything structure. That was his philosophy. So in his mind, it was violence between these pairs of opposites that created this sort of vibration that gave everything an illusion of solidity, right? So that was his idea, that it's violence and tension between opposing pairs. And that's at the heart of a lot of different philosophies. You can see it kind of grow in Taoism, where there is, in the image of the yin and yang, you have the opposing forces, but they're less battling one another and more almost copulating in that image, at the very least dancing with one another. And a bit of one is within the other. And so you have that relationship between opposing pairs, but it's less violent and it's beginning to be more of a dance rather than opposition. Well, when you get to John chapter 1 in the New Testament, the Apostle John takes that concept of logos, which would have been familiar to his readers and or hearers, and he flips it. And he writes, in the beginning was the logos. And an educated person hearing that in that day would have heard opposing pairs brought together into oneness through violence or opposition. But he says, in the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God. So you have a pair. You got things together. And he says, and the logos was with God. So you have the pair. And then he says, and the logos was God. So they become one. So you have pairs becoming one. But he totally flips the script when he says the logos was with, because the word with in Greek means something like face-to-face, union, like an intimacy and a friendship. So for John, the logos wasn't violence where one thing usurped another, thereby creating an illusion of oneness by one thing overcoming another. It was two things literally becoming one thing, right? Finding, let's say, though they're not the same, becoming one thing. And not like, Two-Face from Batman, where it's one thing on this side and one thing on the other side, and they're kind of mushed together as a hybrid, but rather coming together and then something new arising as a result of their coming together. Sort of an alchemical coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites. And so obviously, whatever you believe that thing is, and you might not even believe it, like you might not even have an actual concept of what logos is, but you at the very least have an idea of what ultimate reality looks like. So whatever you believe is at the heart of reality. If you believe it's a hand, you're going to craft a glove to cover the hand, let's say. Whatever you believe the shape is, you're going to create a system to accommodate that shape. So if you believe at the center of reality, it's violence between opposing pairs that establishes order, you're going to create systems that play into that thing. You're going to create systems where we're pitted against one another, where our language is used in such a way that it creates us and them, this side and that side, black hats, white hats, cops and robbers, whatever. You're going to create a dichotomous system like that if that's what you believe is at the center of things. If you believe, though, at the center of things is this force that's sort of pulling us together, where there's this sort of divine memory of the singularity at work within us that's pulling us together, not to like usurp one another and dominate and therefore thereby create the illusion of oneness, but become one thing, you're going to create a system, a philosophy, in a world that looks very different from the one that's just about pitting sides against one another. So with all of that being said, we're getting ready to enter into, and we don't have to really get into politics because I don't want to get into politics. Politics is one of my least favorite things to talk about. It really is. It's important, don't get me wrong, but it's one of those things you can't really talk about without zinging us in that place that turns us into enemies, but we're entering into a season in the US at least where we perform our annual ritual of hating one another, with great intensity, depending on which team we pick. And I'm not saying it's not important, right? I'm not saying who is in the White House is not an important thing. It is. Politics is important. Government's important. These things matter. They're meaningful. However, you can really see what Logos is at work within us, especially this time of year. It gets drawn out of us like metal shavings out of sand when a magnet is waved over top of it. The Logos that's at work within us gets drawn to the surface in seasons like this. And so we're entering into a season where we are going to face many opportunities to relate to one another in terms of opposition, hatred, violence, difference. And we don't even really have to necessarily get into that aspect of it, but it is in the air right now. It's airborne. And it's only going to get worse and worse as time moves forward. So I thought tonight we could talk a little bit about this concept of Logos. I thought we could talk about it, what a better way is, how it is we can avoid being pushed into that way of being, what a better alternative Logos might look like. And we don't even have to use that language, but that's just the way that I'm thinking of it. And I'm framing it because maybe it's just what helps me conceptualize it. So, guys, do you have any thoughts on that?
You know what, Jeff? I just want to jump in because what comes to my mind immediately, and one of the things I miss in our country is being able to have civil dialogue. But dialogue is a Greek word, right? It's dialogos in the Greek.
Yeah.
And so just to kind of bring that in, I think it's really important to, I love everything you said about politics and all of that. And I think it's important, I look for spaces and people who can model dialogue where we can come together and converse on issues rather than allowing those issues to become, like you said, hit us in that place that makes us enemies.
Yeah.
So I just, in light of everything you were saying about Heraclitus and his views on the Logos, and then bringing that in at the end, I just find it really interesting that dialogue is kind of a lost art when it comes to politics.
Yeah. Yeah. That it really is. Language is so powerful. The words we use with one another. I mean, a cephalopod can take its mental workings and create visual representations on the surface of its skin with them, whereas we create vibrations with our vocal cords and form consonants and vowels and are able to take immaterial thoughts from here and communicate them in ways that you're hearing my brain talk to you. I'm hearing your brain talk to me. I am seeing your inner person through your words. I mean, if we don't talk to one another, good God, I mean, we don't know each other. And then all we know of one another is the avatar we're presented. And I think that's why I think I'm not being like a wacko conspiracy dude, but I think even the like playing off the binary of it's either this or that.
Yep.
If not purposeful, it's at the very least just a manifestation of, well, a flaw in our evolution, that we are very tribal like that. And so the very fact that you can't even, that if it's this, it's all this. If it's that, it's all that. There is no room for nuance. I mean, that just goes to show you the Logos that's working between us. It isn't one drawing us together. It is one that's trying to fracture us.
Yeah, for sure.
And we can get into this maybe a little bit too, but this is a show where we can discuss the metaphysics of things too. I do think there is even maybe a metaphysical, or at the very least, psychological and archetypal force at work in that as well. I don't know, Rupert, sir, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, one of the reasons why Andrea brought me into her show and why we're such good friends is that we are able to communicate different ideas, different concepts, different convictions to each other, because we there's a lot of things we don't agree on, but we're able to do that in a way that is peaceful, that is constructive. And constructive doesn't mean that one of us has to win.
Right.
Doesn't mean that one of us has to make their point be the one that wins. We can talk to each other in ways that are constructive and harmonious. Now, I'm coming at this conversation from probably a very different perspective from possibly you too. I'm a scientist. I'm a space scientist, and I use logic to determine reality. Now, if you think about that word logic, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a connection there with logos. But logic is the process of making deductions that have to be correct, that are correct. A lot of people are not well versed in the difference between logic, where you're actually determining a truth, and reason, which is you have a reason for believing what you believe.
Right.
But I come at this from I come at everything from a logical perspective, and using logic, you can know stuff. And that's one of the wonderful things about science. But a good scientist knows that there's a lot that we don't know. Now, if we're talking about the nature of reality, we can use logic to determine truths, which are correct and are real. But some of the things we're talking about here, you can't really use, you can use logic to determine facts, to help inform a discussion, say, on politics or morality, or how do we get along with each other. But a lot of what we're talking about now is subjective. It's more philosophical.
For sure.
And I think politics is important right now. And like you, Jeff, I really like to steer clear of it if I can. I don't even like to be specific about sides. I do like to point out to people in the US that there are many other countries in the world, all with different political parties. It's not just this one versus that one.
No, really? Are you serious?
To shock us, Rupert.
But one thing that I think personally, subjectively, is important is not the concept. I don't hold unity up as being an ideal, because I don't want to unify with evil.
Right.
I don't want to unite with people doing bad things knowingly and not caring and still doing bad things to others. But what I do think is important is for us to, almost from a mathematical perspective, think, what is the thing that would be beneficial for us to maximize? I don't think it is unity. And when you have opposites, unity is very hard. But I think, personally, what I put above everything else, like if I were to try and maximize a variable, a quantity in this, on this planet, in this universe, it is peace. And sometimes being peaceful does not mean unifying. Sometimes I would say that the opposite of unification maybe is separation, and sometimes separation is required for peace. It's okay to block somebody in your social media if you're doing it for peaceful reasons. It's okay for us to even choose not to discuss a certain issue for which we don't seem to be able to be peaceful over, in order that we can be peaceful. It's okay for that country over there to have different convictions than this one, as long as we can be peaceful about it. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think a lot of I think American politics in particular, well, I've only ever been ensconced within the system that is the United States. So I can observe from the outside, but I don't know what it's like to be in that culture and know what it is to feel a part of the culture. But one of the things that seems to be a hallmark, it's not just the US, it's Western civilization in a lot of ways in general, but there is that Protestant germ that's at the heart of it all. Mm-hmm. And Protestantism has at its root protest, and evangelicalism springs off of that. And so Paul Tillich wrote about the Protestant principle, where it is almost kind of like you really can't ever just allow for someone to be. You have to, they have to agree with you, No, you have to see it my way. There is no you existing over there believing what you believe and me existing here believing what I believe and that just being okay. No, because as you said, that piece that has separation, because that absence, that separation actually is a form of nearness and presence, right? Because I am at peace with you in being absent from you, right? It is a form of presence. It's an absence that functions as presence. It's a benevolent presence that is present through absence. The absence of my meddling, the absence of my having to have my hands in your business. But Protestantism is something that just won't let that be. Right. It has to be out evangelizing for whatever the principle is. And it splinters and it morphs. I mean, Protestantism itself is made up of, anytime somebody talks about it, they say anywhere from 30 to 50,000 denominations. But there's at least 30,000+ denominations of Protestant churches that splinter off of Orthodoxy and Catholicism, because that is its logos. That's the fractal that's at its heart. They talk about turtles all the way down. It's kind of infinite regress. Protestantism is protest all the way down. It's layer after layer of protest. And so it's destined to just always fragment and fracture. And eventually you fragment and fracture long enough, it's not deconstruction, it becomes decomposition, and you're really kind of nothing. And so I think that's part of it. We can't just let others be. You have to see it my way. We have to always be evangelizing for a cause instead of just, as you said, be like, hey, man. And I'm not talking about people who are like, I'm not talking about Nazis or somebody who's like actively working to harm somebody, but somebody who just sees things from a different angle. There's absolutely nothing wrong whatsoever, as you say, with just being like, hey, man, that's your thing. My own dad and I, we agreed when I was, we're both pastors. When we came to a point where our theological differences were so pronounced, I began to question doctrines like hell and some of the more fire and brimstone aspects of Christianity, and I discarded them entirely. And at the time, I was really leaning more towards atheism. But obviously that bled through in a more progressive sort of theology. We just agreed with one another. Hey, I love you. I'd rather be your dad and I'd rather just be your son. So let's just not talk about this, and there can be a way in which that hurts. If, like, for me, theology and philosophy are extremely important to me. It's pretty much all I think about, it's, my mind is always, that's just how I think. And so it is maybe hurtful to have to say the thing that's most important to me, I can't talk to one of the most important people in my life about, but for the sake of maintaining that relationship and not living in that violent logos with one another, it's worth it. Aaron, what do you think, my friend?
I really like the reframe, Rupert. And I say reframe because it really feels like, and I love what you said too, Jeff, about Protestantism and protesting being at the root of that word, the logos of it, right? But I do think, as I'm thinking about this and I'm listening to you guys, that this drive for unity can actually create more division, right? Mm-hmm. Because if we make peace the core value, we want to be at peace with one another. We want to have harmonious relationships, even if that means that we're so dissonant from one another that we can't come together at all. Mm-hmm. you know what I'm saying? But if we're really, that Protestant thing is everybody has to think like us. You know, everybody has to believe like us about the Trinity or about baptism or about the color of the carpet. I mean, it gets really ridiculous.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases, you know that very well, I'm sure, Jeff. Things we've seen in ministry that people will fight and split churches and whatever about. So it's just interesting to me that if you look at it, unity from this perspective, then unity is a contributor to a lack of peace and more disharmony. So it's kind of, I find it kind of ironic. Whereas if we accept difference, and I love that you nuanced it, Jeff, by saying, you know, we're not talking about evil. We're not talking about groups that are out there actively trying to do harm. But if we can just sort of live and let live and make peace that goal and that priority, I wonder how different things would be. And yet you don't hear that talked about a lot. I don't hear peace being a centerpiece of conversations today.
No,
so I really like that.
Yeah, Rupert, that was an excellent point, centering point you made about it being peace, which can come through a decided upon separation rather than a constant forcing people metaphorically to sit in the same room with each other and get along. You know, because go ahead.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting exercise also to compare to think about what happens if you do put other factors above peace. If you put, for example, a religious belief or any belief above peace, like God gave us this land,
right?
Or your political party, if you put that above peace, if you put your country above peace, anything at all you put above peace results in a community or a society or a country that is not able to even aim for realistic peace. And if you look at all of the wars going on around the world right now, all of the armed conflict, even the social and emotional conflict going on in social media, a lot of it is people who are placing other things above peace.
So true.
One little debate I've been a friendly debate that I've been having with some of my friends, people in my groups over the last several months is, which should we put first, peace or love? And that's a hard one because, well, isn't love this wonderful thing? Have you guys seen the Avatar movies?
I've seen the first one. I haven't seen the second one yet.
Yeah, I think of peace as I think of a world. I'm a sci-fi fan, so I like to, and sci-fi is great at theorizing what happens if you put this at the top of the list or this at the top of the list, or it's great for extremes. But Avatar, that world that they live on, Pandora, for me that sort of seems a little bit like those Na'vi, those tribes, people living out there in the forest or in the natural lands of Pandora. They love nature. They have this very special spiritual loving relationship with all life, with all beings, but they still kill them, which is not a peaceful thing. So for me, I mean, I actually love the idea of living on Pandora, but I'm not sure that I would be okay with. I'm a vegan, just so people know. I'm a pacifist. I'm not sure if I would be okay with killing all of those wonderful organisms when there's so much plant life that you could eat. But that, to me, that planet is a little bit like what it would be like if we could all put love above everything. And what's interesting is a lot of atrocities in this world have happened through people who feel like they're loving others by imposing stuff upon them. And so yeah, I think it's just an interesting intellectual exercise to think about what could we put on top. But interestingly enough, I think that love doesn't need to be like a mathematical variable in that way. I think unconditional love outside of any mathematical equation outside of any logical analysis. Unconditional love is an absolute possibility. You can love, and I'm not talking about like romantic relationship love, where, yeah, you have to put a few conditions upon being in a romantic relationship with somebody. But if we could, even if we dislike somebody or disagree with somebody, disagree with their ways, their behavior, if we could still love them because we know that they're sentient, conscious beings, they have feelings, they have a sense of well-being or not. If we could just love all humans regardless of differences, regardless of any condition, regardless of age, gender, ethnic background, appearance, nationality, etc., etc. And we could do that with all conscious beings universally, including the other vertebrates on this planet, the other sentient life on this planet, the other sentient life in the universe, regardless of what they look like. Then the world and the universe would be a better place. And you can do that. You can love unconditionally and still put peace as your priority. You don't have to lose unconditional love, because there is no condition on it in order to aim for peace.
Yeah. No, I like that. And I think too, if I'm just, as you're talking, I'm thinking through as you're talking about it. So obviously these thoughts are, there might still be a little bit of raw egg in the cookie dough, if you will, because it's not fully baked. But if love is at the center of, let's say, as individuals, we're centered in love. As individuals, we're centered in love. Then it manifests itself as peace, right? That's, you know, so my individual goal is to love another as though they were me, right? And that may sound solipsistic and egotistical, I suppose, but that's kind of my goal, is to understand who I am as a person, how I work, how I function, all the nuances and the minutia, all that makes me me. I am a bundle of complexities. I am a bundle of all sorts of complicated experiences and moments all coming together that makes me me. I'm all sorts of idiosyncrasies and all that. And I might be one way in a moment, but that might not be me. You know what I mean? I might react a certain way in a situation. And if you just take a screenshot of me and you're like, this is Jeff, you know, psychologically speaking, I think that's what the prohibition against idol worship in scripture points to, is taking a thing that is mercurial and that's always changing and moving and adapting, and it's bigger than any 1 second, right? And trying to take a snapshot of that thing in a moment and calcifying it and saying, this is what it is. And it's like, no, that's not what it is. It's much larger than the screenshot you have of it, as is the individual human being. You're much more than that. And psychologically, I think that's what that's a projection of, is humanity ought not to be approached the same way either. You know yourself. You know you're a bundle of complexities and idiosyncrasies and pains and joys and all this kind of stuff. And if you can project that onto the other, you love yourself for who you are, and you see others the way that they are, it'll manifest itself as peace. Because when they react a certain way, you will stop yourself and say, how would I have reacted? Probably similarly. Does that mean that's the crux of who I am as a person? No. So I don't feel the need to pursue that grievance and make a thing of it, because love of myself, again, not in some kind of weird way, but is at the center, and then it manifests itself in love, but that love looks like a striving for peace. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of how I was framing that as you were talking. Rupert, Aaron, you're going to say something?
Yeah, I kind of struggle with the idea of unconditional love, and I'll tell you why. It's really a linguistic issue that I have. It's totally linguistics. You know, when we're talking about language, we're talking about meaning. And so, you know, if I hold up, I've got Coca-Cola in my glass, we all pretty much agree on that because it's very concrete, right? When you start talking about love, you're getting into so many different abstractions that when people use that word, what are they referencing? Like if I say I have a glass of Coke, even if people are just listening and they're not watching, they can get an image in their mind, and we're all going to agree generally on what that is, right? May differ on the size of the cup and that kind of stuff. But when you're talking about these abstractions, which love is, then what are we really talking about? Are we talking, is love a verb? Are we talking about, we taught, I don't know, Jeff, if you did, but I assume, especially at marriage conferences, love is not a feeling, it's a choice.
Mm-hmm.
So we
Right,
reduce
right.
it down to a behavior, just grit your teeth and do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or is it a feeling, or is it, what are these things?
Yeah.
So it's something that I've wrestled with, like
Mm-hmm.
what does that actually mean when we talk about unconditional love? I love this person unconditionally. What does that actually mean? How does that translate into something concrete in terms of the process of relating with another human being or a set group of people? And I guess where I've landed, because I do have a counseling background, Carl Rogers, who was one of the early, I think, humanist psychologists and thinkers, he coined the phrase unconditional positive regard. And so I guess that's where I've landed with it when I talk about it or think about it, is to be able to regard someone in a positive way without allowing my own value judgments to get in the way, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I do think that's a key component. I think it comes back to this whole idea of peace, because if I can regard you in a positive light unconditionally, even when your behaviors or your way of thinking or your style of dress or the way you present yourself violates some value judgment that I have consciously or unconsciously that I'm making, then I think that creates the atmosphere or the environment or the environment for peace to grow. I don't think you can have peace if you don't begin from someplace, whether you call it unconditional love or unconditional positive regard or whatever. But I just find love a really problematic term to use with people, because I don't know if we're all even talking about the same thing when we talk about it, if that makes sense.
And no, for sure. And I mean, yeah, if you're talking about it today, you're talking about something very different than you would have been talking about several centuries ago, before the concept of romantic love even was
For sure
a thing. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and it's because of this difficulty in defining what is love that I think I actually don't put it on my list of this has to be at the top, this has to be second. It's it does mean different things to different people, and I do not know if all conscious entities around the universe have the capacity to feel love in the way that I consider love to feel. When I but I think people do understand what peace is. I think peace, being able to coexist without conflict, in a way that maintains well-being, I think is probably easier for people to grasp.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. I've done a lot of sort of counseling and coaching in the past, and some people you will ask, some people start talking about love, and you can ask them the question, what is love to you? And they will say, well, I don't know. What is love? I don't know if I've ever experienced love. And I think there are a wide range of different abilities to experience the feeling of love and to be able to also define it. And I think partly it's because of how we were raised and what relationships we've had, with our parents, with other people, with animals, with nature, with our society in general. So it is a tricky one. It is a tricky one.
Absolutely. Something you were saying before to Rupert, and it goes with what you were saying as well, Aaron, that I was thinking, pardon me, is the drive for conformity that can spring off of our concept of love, because we perceive there as being like an existential threat to individuals if they don't believe as we do. So, like, as an example, when I started questioning the doctrine of hell, for example, when I was neck deep in all of that and very much believed in heaven and hell, and I started questioning that, excuse me, And I fell in with others who were doing the same thing. And, you're having discussions with these people. And oftentimes people would get really angry and upset at people who were still preaching hell and teaching people about that and warning people against it. And, I always found myself in a different camp. And maybe it's because it's, again, knowing myself a little bit more. But when I taught people about heaven and hell, I taught them about heaven and hell because I cared and I didn't want them to go there.
Okay.
I really believed it. As backwards as it seems to me now, at the time, I really believed everyone was born pretty much destined for damnation unless they believed exactly as I did. You know what I mean? And it's like, if you have a modicum of care and compassion in your heart, you are going to want people to believe the way you do so that they won't experience that. And, so that there's that kind of evangelical drive again. And in some ways, I think that's in some ways kind of like, for lack of a better term, the spirit that kind of animates a lot of even postmodern Enlightenment thinking, because it still comes from that worldview, even if it's in opposition to it. Some of that's still at the center of it. And even if it's like, even if so, like when I was dabbling in atheism and I found like the new atheists whom I loved and, benefited from their works a lot, but I found that a lot of them had the same passion as my evangelical brethren, and if I listened to a Richard Dawkins, I loved Richard Dawkins, but he was as evangelical as Billy Graham, and his whatever. And at first, I just sort of liked it and glommed onto it because I was in that phase of wanting to criticize Christianity. But the more I thought about it, the more I was like, I don't necessarily know if the spirit of this is all that much different. And then if you listen, though, at the heart of the argument, there's like, if you don't abandon this religious way of thinking, you're going to doom and damn the world. And like the new atheism is it came off of 9/11. That's really where these people and these thinkers existed beforehand. Dan Dennett, Sam Harris, Dawkins, Hitchens, who were called the four horsemen of the new atheism, basically. And a lot of the other thinkers, they were there and they were teaching and doing their thing beforehand. But post 9/11, there was this great critique of religion and certain religious ideologies that began to become prominent. And a lot of these guys rose to prominence in their criticism of religion. And there was as passionate a call and a cry against religion as there was from religion against atheism, because one was saying, no, if you believe that way, you're going to go to hell. And the other was saying, well, if you believe that way, you're going to terraform the planet into a hellscape. So both saw each other as posing an existential threat to one another and to themselves. And so their love motivated this kind of become like me,
Mm-hmm.
And that's just one example. But I think that's also, to bring it back to what we were talking about at first, a manifestation of that Heraclitean logos, where it's opposing things still have to become one with each other, but they become one by one usurping the other. Whereas in what you would call the Johannine logos, or the logos that John talks about in John 1, he's talking about things that, so in the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, whether we believe it's reality or not, just simply think of it as a symbol and as a metaphor, and much more symbolic than a literal thinker when it comes to religious symbols. Obviously you have to be, because you're talking symbols. But Trinity to me represents things that retain distinct identity, Father, Son, and Spirit, principles that remain distinct from one another, but that can be spoken of as one. You can call them one thing, though they're three things, and they're one, but their oneness is not, they're pushed together into this like hybrid where, again, it's like the Batman villain Two-Face, where it's this half is this thing, this half is the other, or Janus, the Janus, face. They're three things, essentially, with distinct identities that you can speak of as being one thing. And the ancient word the church used for that was perichoresis, which means to move or dance in a circle. And I often use the illustration for people, like, how many times have you laid on your back staring up at your ceiling fan late at night, and those blades spin so fast it almost looks like it's a disc. It almost looks like a circle just hovering there, but it's not. It's the movement that causes them to seem solid. And so that moving in the circle of things that retain their distinctive identities causes a unity to appear, right? That if you flip the switch, you'd see they're still separate. So I think in the doctrine of the Trinity, there's at least a symbol, this archetypal symbol that we reach for of retaining distinct identity, but you can find a kind of oneness whilst retaining that identity. And that movement is symbolically love that manifests itself as peace, coexistence, while, I know we don't like the word tolerance, but I think in some ways, maybe it's a word we should bring back, because I don't need people to celebrate everything about me. And I also understand I'm not a marginalized person. So I've never felt uncelebrated necessarily. So I don't mean to say anything that I'm definitely not saying, but like, I don't need everything about me to be, you're completely like, oh, Jeff, I love everything that you're doing. It's great. It's wonderful. Keep going. I love everything you say and everything you do. I'd be perfectly happy sometimes if people just left me alone. You know what I mean? And hey, if you want to be cool with what I'm saying and holler amen from the back, cool, man. But if not, equally cool, And I think that's yeah. Anyways, I won't yammer on about that.
I want to highlight what you said, Jeff, because I could relate so well. When you think that something is an existential threat, or you think a behavior or an action or the way you're presenting yourself is preventing an existential threat, mm-hmm. and then you throw love on top of that, mm-hmm. like, and especially early on in my late teens, early 20s, like I was totally convinced of the evangelical gospel. I was totally convinced that everybody I met, everybody I knew that didn't have Christ as their savior was destined for an eternity of torment. And if you love people at all, then you want to, and here's the trick, right? The way you get out of that existential torment is you believe like me.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And so then I have a responsibility driven by love. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't think about any other consequences in relationships. Yep. So yep. I preached to all my friends. I preached to strangers on the street. I preached to relatives. I'm sure I was rude. I'm sure I was offensive. I know I was violating people's boundaries, but none of that matters, right? If the house is on fire and the fire department shows up, they're going to break your windows. They're going to break down your door, do whatever they have to do to get you out of the house, right? So when you believe that, so that is where love can become problematic. Mm-hmm. And it's to tie that. And then with the new atheists, I can relate to that too, because my perception of that group is that, instead of the love of money being the root of all evil, religion is the root of all evil and the reason for all conflict on planet Earth. And if we can just eradicate religion, then the human race will improve. And so, but the logos, or to use, Rupert's term, the logic behind that, I think is really important. What, in John's gospel, you and I know it says in the beginning was the logos, but in the English version, it says in the beginning was the word. Yep. And so what's the word or the thought or the logic that we build up within ourselves that then drives us to do things that are actually coming from the best of intentions, mm-hmm. but creating chaotic results in the earth?
Yeah. Well, and you know what? Maybe that's why I love conversations like this, because that's when you see that, like I'll never forget when I first started practicing meditation, and I wouldn't have called it meditation. I would have called it contemplative prayer, or whatever, Yeah. But it was meditation. And, but I would just sit in my office. And when I was a pastor, I had a very nice plush office, and it was great. I miss those days sometimes, but, I would just sit out there in this leather chair with like instrumental music playing, and I would just sit and bask and just sit in complete silence and learn to still myself. I was working off of the works of Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross and some of the Catholic mystics, and that was all new territory for me. But as I learned to just be silent and still and feel my entire self come into oneness and be perfectly present in that room, instead of scattered in 10,000 directions, planning the Sunday service, planning the Wednesday service, planning the Tuesday service, got to visit this person, got to visit that person, got to prepare this sermon, got to visit this hospital, whatever. Just let everything converge in this moment and just be there. An hour, 2 hours. I would just find myself laying on the floor, motionless and numb. I just couldn't even get up, just totally overwhelmed under this heavy blanket of just presence in the moment. And I would get up from that and I would go to the store. And I'll never forget the first time it happened to me when I was learning to practice this. I was still believing the way that I used to believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I would see people who, according to my belief system, weren't in the way that I was in, right? They weren't saved. They weren't whatever. But something was transforming in my inner person through meditation that I wasn't really theologically informed yet. The theology kind of followed. But I would look at people, and instead of seeing this chaotic, look at, this person, whatever, I would just see, it was like I would see them as one as I saw myself. And I'll never forget the time. I mean, I'll never forget it, ever. Changed my life. I was in the protein bar aisle at a local grocery store buying a diet root beer and a protein bar. And that long meditation session took it out of me, and I needed some sustenance. And I saw a person who, at the time, I would not have, again, believed was saved, quote unquote. And, they were advertising their participation in a lifestyle that at the time would have landed them on the outside of the fence in my very limited thinking back then.
Right.
And I'm sitting there watching them, and this person is helping their elderly mother pick up a heavy item off the bottom shelf and put it into the shopping cart. And that's all they did. That's all they did. And when they did that, it was like, I just saw everything I thought of when I thought of God kind of condense, and it was that person in that moment, in that action. And in my mind, they weren't even saved. You know what I mean? But I saw a human being loving someone the way that I love someone. And I just lost it. And I'm sitting there, diet root beer in one hand, protein bar in the other, weeping in the middle of the aisle while staring at this woman helping her mother. And, God bless them. They probably thought I was insane. But I'm just sitting there weeping like, just tears streaming down my face as I'm watching them, because I'm seeing the truth about people, for the first time. It's dawning on me, and it was coming as a result of meditation. Really, it was bizarre, but I don't know. Anyways, as you were saying about like the person who really believes they're helping, even if they're hurting, if you can humanize that person and look at them and like see them for who they are, see them for what they're really doing, blow the dust away of their action and see the flame that's burning in the center of them. It is love. It's the same thing that burns in the center of your heart when you plan a vacation for your family or do something nice for your mother or for your lover or whomever. It's that same pilot light that burns in the center of all of us. It's this love for this person, whatever that is, and why ever it's there. But it has to pass through our belief systems when it manifests itself. Mm-hmm. And if it passed through a belief system that says, well, everyone's damned and going to hell, that love is going to look like, hey, you're damned and going to hell, believe as I do, or else, or, your religion is going to destroy the world. So stop being an idiot and throw away these archaic bullshit books and buy the God Delusion, or whatever, whatever it is, that at the center of it, there is love, and it's people all trying to do the same thing. It's just passing through filters.
Yeah.
Reaches us. So look at that. But if we could all learn to do that, anyways, go ahead.
Yeah, no, before we go any further, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to talk to two very wise individuals. Thank you so much for having this discussion and being able to do it in a peaceful way. I really appreciate it.
100% mutual, my friend.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you. I'm going to put you to a question. As I was talking about science fiction, where you can take any concept and take it to its extreme. If we think...
Sorry. That's ringtone, sorry.
Okay.
That's okay. If we recognize that it can be problematic, even if we're coming from a perspective, from a center, a focus of love, if we're channeling that through a belief system, such that we're affecting others, that can be problematic. Could you imagine a planet? Could you imagine Earth being this planet where we really use logic to its fullest extent? We only accept things as being true when they have been logically proved and therefore determined to factually be reality. And we just simply didn't believe. We didn't accept anything as being true without logical proof. We could still theorize.
Mm-hmm.
We could still have ideas. We could still think, well, this is based on the available evidence. This is probably true, but I don't think it's been conclusively proved yet. Do you think having that ability to step back from beliefs might help take the sting out of any harm that we might inadvertently be causing to others through our religious, political, social, moral beliefs?
You want to answer that first, Jeff? Or?
I was just going to say, Aaron, you want to take that one first? No,
okay, so Rupert, I mean, that is a great question, and I have to filter it through years of counseling and mental health. I think as a society, that would be wonderful. And one of the things that I've worked on personally, because I was so extreme and dogmatic and zealous in my younger years, and then wised up a little bit and came around more to, what do we actually know? What do we actually prove? Kind of going back to like the glass, right? We can all agree this is a glass with Coca-Cola in it, but we get into these more subjective or abstract areas. I've learned to, I'm working on still adapting my language, even when I talk about it, so that I'm saying, I think, I believe, I wonder if, I'm curious if, rather than, because as I'm sure, Jeff, you can relate to this, when you think you're speaking for God, you're speaking with a level of authority that your beliefs are coming out with a level of authority that's quite scary.
Yeah.
And so on a macrocosmic level, I think that is an interesting solution to a lot of the problems. Like if there could be a planet where we agree on these logical things that logically hold up and stand up under scrutiny and stand up under critical thinking, and then everything else becomes part of the dialogue that we were talking about earlier, but it's presented subjectively rather than with some kind of authority and God forbid any kind of divine authority, right? And then when I look at it through what I might call the microcosm level, the individual person, I do realize that as human beings, most of us have to have a narrative about our lives in order to make sense of who we are and to make sense about our lives and to have direction. What's the story that we tell about who we are and about our lives? And what religion does, and I'll just speak to that because that was my life for 25 years, is it gives you a solid narrative. It gives you at least the impression of a narrative that you can trust. And Jeff mentioned deconstruction earlier, and that's a term that is really, floating around for a lot of people, because a lot of people, with access to the internet and access to Amazon and podcasts and YouTube and all that stuff, they are rethinking their faith. And so for me, it wasn't like just giving up belief in Santa Claus, because my entire story, what helped me make sense out of my past traumas, what helped me make sense out of who I was as a human being, what helped me get up in the morning, was that my story was, I'm on the side of light. I'm on the side of good. There is a being out there that I call God that I can trust, that has foreseen everything. So therefore now I don't have to have a search for meaning. I have meaning. And I think as human beings, meaning is so intrinsically a part of who most people are as individuals. And that's where these beliefs and these stories and these ideas come in, because they give us meaning. So the people that are, on either side, to bring politics, back into the discussion just in a general way, but in America that are on either side of the aisle, they get up every day with a strong sense of meaning that they're going to make America great again, or that they're going to be progressive and more diverse and more inclusive. And that gives them meaning. But again, meaning is subjective, right? And so what's meaningful to one person isn't going to be the same as what's meaningful to another person. So what I hear you suggesting is, what if we had a society where the primary source of meaning for our lives came from logic and everything else became secondary? So that's just like Jeff said earlier, that's just some egg yolk in the cookie dough, definitely not fresh baked, but I think it's a wonderful thought experiment.
I agree, and yeah, I concur with what you're saying, Aaron, because and I mean, I guess, Rupert, this might come from Aaron and I both having more religious backgrounds, for sure, which also says something probably about the way that we're wired versus the way that other people are wired. I mean, in my own household, we have brains that are wired very, very differently. My son is a very, very, very literal thinker. I am very symbolic. You know what I mean? I watched The Dark Knight, and I'm sitting there and I'm like, well, that's symbolic of this. Oh, and that's clearly Girardian philosophy at work there. Oh, and when the Batmobile crashes and he's like in the tunnel in The Dark Knight, and that's clearly like death. And when the Bat Pod pops out, that's resurrection. And when he's going down the street and knocking the mirrors off the cars, that's him keeping people from seeing their shadow self. Like, I'm always thinking in terms of symbol, like symbol and archetype and psychology. That's just the way my brain works.
Yeah.
And I can drive people nuts with that. I can drive myself nuts with that too. Believe me, I've got to tamp it down. But I think, so Aaron and I, or I can at least speak for myself, I know that I am one who I'm at least used to having a narrative that gives me a sense of meaning. But I've seen it from both sides, I guess. I've Joni Mitchell'd this thing. Where I was a very radical fundamentalist Christian, very literal in my beliefs about everything. Literal 6-day creation, literal death, literal resurrection, everything was literal. The Bible was essentially, a Discovery Channel documentary without any bias of exactly what happened. And that was it. Well, and then my fundamentalism gave way to the opposite. I think it worked. It naturally did what it does, which it deconstructs itself. Nietzsche said that because he's like, Christianity, and I think is it Will to Power or Beyond Good and Evil? I don't know. I think it's Beyond Good and Evil. He said that Christianity will naturally undo itself because it posits the pursuit of truth as being the primary thing. And so it sort of develops that as the most important thing, which is truth at all costs. And so then it naturally causes you to pursue truth at all costs, even if the cost is your faith, and then that's what happened for me. I pursued truth at all costs, and then I lost the faith that I had as a child because it just didn't work anymore. I realized logically this just doesn't work, and it fell off. And for a season, I was an atheist while pastoring a church. And as I've said before, that's a difficult task, but I managed it. I don't know. I tried, and I wasn't being dishonest. I was really just being very honest with myself and trying to help people the best I could. But then on the other side of that, and I guess it's kind of even what I'm talking about with things that seem opposite coming together in a way, that atheism, that strict fundamentalist theism and that atheism kind of came together and they became something entirely different, like, so for me now, my faith is very vibrant, but I don't take it all that seriously, which I don't even know how to explain that. I just don't hold on to it very tightly, but it still imbues my life with great meaning, even though at the end of the day, you could put a cross through the wood chipper in front of me and I wouldn't shed a tear, unless, of course, a piece of sawdust got in my eye. Like, I mean, I see it as symbols. It's fingers pointing at moons and all that. To me, it's something that hints at something else, and it's that something else I have a suspicion about that is important. And to me, it's just like this certain set of symbols orients me in a certain direction towards love and compassion, which maybe that's just who I am, and I choose these symbols to help me make sense of that. You know, like Joseph Campbell talks about the hero with 1,000 faces. Every culture tells essentially the same story. It's just the hero wears a different face. You know, it's summed up in Finnegan's Wake, you know, HCE, the character, which means here comes everyone, you know, this archetypal figure who's every hero, you know, and maybe we each choose one as a sort of playable character in a game. We choose to say, I'm going to identify with this one. This is the one that most represents me. And for me, Christianity works, maybe just because I grew up in it. I don't know. But I'll say that but I agree with what you're saying too. And I guess that's even kind of how I approach my own faith. And I know when you hear people say faith, you automatically think a willingness to believe unbelievable things, kind of. But for me, it's more just like, it's more like the faith that, like, I just trust that for some reason this works. You know what I mean? I think it was Emmanuel Levinas, the Jewish philosopher, who said that faith is the belief that love without reward is valuable. And I kind of work with that. Like, loving the people around me without expecting that they're going to pay me back in kind is a valuable thing. And it usually doesn't end up that way. It does usually come back to me. And so there is a reward there. But when I don't expect it, then I'm not disappointed. I'm not resentful. And I'm just a loving, happy person. And I guess that's kind of what I base it on. So to me, that's kind of like faith. It's like a trust that for whatever reason, this set of symbols that I work with works for me. So it is kind of a logical approach in a way, but like I would never impose it on someone else, and I don't take it seriously.
I think that's the difference. Sorry to cut you off, Jeff.
No, man, go ahead.
I think that's the difference. Like, I think it's okay to say, does this belief, this narrative works for me? It serves me. It empowers me. It gives me a reason to get up in the morning, that kind of stuff. And to realize I'm choosing it not because it's logically accurate, or it's verifiable or repeatable or something that I need to push on other people, but simply because it works for me. That's a totally different mindset. That's a totally different logic or logos, right? Than I've got the absolute truth and I have to get it out because everybody's going to go to hell if I don't.
You know? Yeah. And I think, you know, Paul Ricoeur, if you're familiar with the works of Paul Ricoeur at all, I think it's in the, I don't remember which book it's in, but, well, one of his big concepts is the idea of a second naivete, you know? And so he puts forth the masters of suspicion, and the masters of suspicion for Ricoeur are Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche. And Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche sort of, they make us all suspicious about religion, about systems, and they make us suspicious about different things. You know, for Marx, everything's a class struggle. For Freud, a kind of sexuality, you know, that's kind of at the heart of everything. For Nietzsche, it's the will to power that's at the heart of everything. You could probably put Darwin in there as one of the masters of suspicion now as well, just kind of this natural drive. But anyways, there's these different thinkers who've been injected into the bloodstream of Western civilization, and then we've spread them, we've coughed and spread it all over the place. That has made us suspicious of the systems that we once had no reason to be suspicious of. And, you know, Ricoeur's idea was like, instead of railing against these guys, embrace it as a friend. Because it's called to look critically at something you never had the ability to look critically at, because no one, frankly, was ever critical of it. It was all anyone ever thought or believed. And now someone's presented you with the opportunity to be critical of this thing that's the most important thing in the world to you. So if your critical approach to it makes it fall apart, maybe it's not as important as you thought. Or if your critical approach to it causes you to be able to reinterpret it and see it a different way and it still works, then still thank these masters of suspicion for helping you to see something you wouldn't have otherwise seen. And I think for me, that's what it kind of did. And that's, for Ricoeur, the second naivete is what, you know, first naivete, you can't help it. You're just naive. You don't know any better. And then you lose that through maturity and growing up. And second naivete is something you can return to willingly. It's like when C.S. Lewis said, one day you'll be old enough to read fairy tales again. You know, it's like, You go through a phase where you're into it. It's like even when like we were talking about sci-fi earlier, as a kid, science fiction was one thing. It was just a great action movie, laser guns and space travel and all this kind of stuff. And then you go through a season of life maybe where you leave it behind. And now as an adult watching it with a lot of thought behind me, I'm like, ooh, what a metaphor for this and what a metaphor for that. And I'm thinking of it less in terms of space battles, and I'm looking at it more in terms of like the symbolism of what's being talked about here. And that's kind of more like the second naivete approach to religion, where it's like I went through that first naivete where it's all real, it's all really, really real. But my belief that it was real was causing my world to tear apart, and it was encouraging me to go out and tear the worlds of other people apart, right? But religion actually means to bind together, re legare, that's what its actual function should be, is to cause those disparate parts of your life to kind of come together in some kind of cohesive whole and make sense. It's supposed to be a framework in which you can just make sense of things, Instead it was blowing my world apart and causing me to blow other people's worlds apart. So I lost that naive approach, and then I came at it from a more critical approach. And then on the other side of it, I was able to look at it more from this approach of like seeing the value of the symbolism, seeing the value that I just don't think we're going to get rid of it. You know what I mean? As a species, I just think we evolved in such a way that most people do need a narrative. And whether that's the triumph of science or whether it's the triumph of Christ over death, I think we do kind of need that story that helps us aim upward and aim toward a sort of higher ideal. That's just my opinion on it. So
thank you very much, Jeff. I'm just going to pause for a second and thank all the people who are out there watching. And there's a lot of people leaving comments.
Yeah.
I'm just going to scroll quickly through and say hello to just a few people. Lynn, hello, Candice, Marie, Laura. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Nikki, thank you for your contributions. Melissa, it's good to have you with us again. A lot of people have been commenting. Terry, thank you for being here. A lot of these are people that we know, and thank you so much, everybody. Amir, yes, I agree with your comment there. And there's hundreds of messages and comments left, so I'm not going to go through them all, but I just want to say thank you to everybody for being here.
Yeah, same.
I was actually raised religious.
Mm-hmm.
And I went through the same process a lot of people go through, stuff happening in my life, and I'm trying to reconcile how can this be happening if I'm believing in God. And then I was going to university, doing a degree in physics with space science and technology, and I'm asking questions there, and they're giving me logical answers. I'm asking my religious leaders the same questions, and they're saying that's the devil in you talking, stop asking those questions.
Yeah.
And I got to the stage where logic was giving me answers. I realized that's the way to understand reality. But throughout my life, it's not just reality I've been trying to understand, it's morality.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are a lot of people out there who are not religious, who are trying to figure out, well, how do I find my direction? What is my narrative? How do I determine what good is and what bad is and what right is and what wrong is? And so I think it would be helpful, might be interesting to take this conversation in that direction and just ask ourselves a little bit about what do we even mean by good and bad? Mm-hmm. Can we have a definition of good and bad or right and wrong, which I would say are two quite different things? Can we even have well thought out definitions without falling back on a belief system? Is there any reasonable approach to coming up with, even if it's a theorized absence of God or somebody higher, bigger, telling us this is right and this is wrong, can we come up with a reasonable alternative? So I'm going to start with the basics of that, and I'm going to ask both of you, either of you, doesn't matter who goes first, to tell me, first of all, how would you define what good is and bad is? What is the definition, even without going into the specifics?
Sure. you'd think I'd have a ready answer to that as a former pastor and still somewhat minister. But without wading into a metaphysical way of speaking about it, I would say, well-being. I may even approach it from like Sam Harris's Moral Landscape view. If you're familiar with that book, I think well-being of myself as an individual and working toward the well-being of others in whatever way it's within my power to do so.
And that is good.
Is good, and we could say, how do we know it's good? Well, there's a scripture. Said I wasn't going to wade into metaphysics, but I think it's a good illustration for it. There's a scripture in Isaiah that says, where God says, I create light and darkness. And that's often a scripture people say, well, so God says he creates the good and the bad. But one way I've heard that interpreted in some rabbinic traditions is God says, I create light, thereby creating darkness, right? Because darkness is the natural state of things. Light breaks into darkness, thereby causing a distinction. Okay, well, if you think of darkness as being sort of the natural state of things, but also kind of being a negative, so think of darkness as being entropy and chaos, which is sort of the natural state of things in a way, despite the fact that we do have these brief blips of what seems like progress. Things are it's all heading towards entropy in one way or another. And, but we're light beamed into consciousness, in a sense, is light beamed into the dark of chaos and disorder. And we're here trying to make it a little more tolerable, I suppose, because we're all here. We're light that's appeared in darkness, quote unquote, symbolically. And so now we distinguish between the two. We call the natural state of things, which is what's going on in the Crab Nebula or whatever right now. It's just not conscious enough to be like, boy, it's crazy up here. It's just chaos. It's stuff banging into other stuff and explosions. That's kind of the natural state of the cosmos. And then you have conscious beings placed in the middle of that. And we're like, oh, this is bad because it hurts us, And so I think we now create a distinction between good and evil because we're able to experience pain and the opposite of well-being. And we're like, oh, this is not good. It hurts when this happens to me. It must also then hurt when it happens to other people. So how can I reduce that both for myself and for other people? And I think that's good. And I think that's where a distinction comes in. If the chaos is the natural way of things, the trying to make that chaos a little more bearable, I think one could call good, if that makes sense.
I struggle with this one.
Yeah, no, me too.
I struggle with this one. Something that impacted me, it's a silly story, but I'll share it because it really got me thinking differently about this issue. So I was going through a mild depression, I guess. And one of the ways I was coping with that a few years ago was I would sit out on my back porch, and for whatever reason, these two birds decided to build a nest on my back porch. And they still come back every year. It's amazing. It's been 3 or 4 years now. And I took solace in that. Like, my therapy at that moment was watching these birds build their nest, watching how hard they worked, right, to build this nest. And then mom lays the eggs, and then they have the baby birds. And then I'm watching mom and dad feed the birds. And I'm like, they're part of my family now, right? Like, just watching this. And I come outside, and I was given, I think by my mother, a deep, deep hatred and phobia of snakes, because where I live, we have a lot of rattlesnakes and stuff. And there was an incident when I was younger where there was a rattlesnake, and it was traumatic. And besides that, the snake is the devil in the Bible, right? So lots of reasons to hate. And I walk outside on my porch, and so I have a 2-level home, and so the porch is on the first level, and there's a deck, so the nest is being built up by the deck. And I walk out my screen door, and there's a bull snake, huge bull snake, on the top of the door, getting into the nest, getting ready to swallow these birds. And mom and dad are just going nuts, right? And so my immediate reaction is that snake is the devil. Actually, my immediate reaction was to scream like a little girl. but we, throw that snake off, chase the snake off. I wanted to kill the snake. And then I looked at it from this perspective, from the bird's perspective, because we talk about, it's easy to say, I think, whatever causes harm is evil, whatever doesn't cause harm is good. But from this perspective, at least in nature, that was a good day for that snake, man. It found a good, easy meal. And for the birds, that was a really evil thing.
Yeah.
Because you're going to eat my babies.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it was evil because I don't like snakes and because I bonded with the birds. But then I realized I prevented that snake from having its meal that day. So was I being evil?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So for me, it's a really complex issue to dogmatically identify any characteristic with good and with evil. And yet we still need to do that as a society. I think there are things certainly that I would recognize, behaviors in society that I won't mention, that I think you would have a large consensus. That's an evil deed that someone did. You know what I mean? So I don't know, man. I want to listen to you guys because guys, I want to, because this is a tough one for me.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, and just think of the accidental mass genocide we create when we participate in when we step on an anthill. You know what I mean? It's like, or like the other day while mowing my lawn, I accidentally hit a living creature, that was in the grass, and I felt so terrible, but I kept mowing my lawn. You know what I mean? I didn't stop and weep. I mean, I felt bad, but it was like, I'm not saying that was a good day for me. But it was just like it does make you wonder, like, so, and then Rupert, I want to hear your thoughts on this. Like, when we're talking about stuff like this, does it have to do with levels of consciousness? You know what I mean? Like, is the gnat obviously less conscious than us? It's not sitting there contemplating, or maybe it is relative to its level of consciousness. But if it sees baby gnat get swatted, it might not sit there and question the universe and rend its garment and weep in sackcloth and ashes, or maybe it does the equivalent of that. But it's like, I don't know. But then obviously, as a vegan, that is obviously something you take into consideration as well when we're talking about levels of consciousness and the pain caused to creatures and what have you. So I agree with you, Aaron. I think for us, good and evil, it's all about us. That's really that's how we interpret it. It's like, does it, and even in my answer, I can kind of see that now where I'm like, does it cause me pain? Yeah, well, that's bad. Does it cause you pain? That's bad. Okay, how can I reduce this for me? How can I reduce it for you? But sometimes the reduction of that pain for me would have looked like going out and hunting an animal so my family could eat. But then, as you said, it's a very bad day for the woolly mammoth family down the road, So it would take a couple more hours probably to give a great answer for this, but I will still, for the moment, and please blow my mind, Rupert, and challenge me. But for the moment, I think my view usually comes down to something like, have you ever watched the show True Detective? Mm-hmm. The first season, True Detective. I think it's one of the greatest pieces of television ever made. It's just a phenomenally written show, a masterpiece philosophically from beginning to end. It's beautiful. And spoiler alert for anyone watching, I won't spoil any details of it, but at the end of the show, the two main characters are exiting a hospital after having stared evil basically in the face, essentially. And they're looking up at the character who's been most optimistic throughout the show is consoling the character who's been the most pessimistic. And he says, look up at the sky, look at the stars, whatever. And he was like, does seem to me like the dark has a lot more territory. And then the other character responds by saying, you're looking at that the wrong way. Once there was only dark. It seems to me like the light is winning. So darkness is the natural state. Darkness is no thingness. It's what there is when there's nothing. When light enters, you now can make a distinction between two things. Whereas before you wouldn't have even thought to comment on the darkness because it's all that there is. But the moment that spark of consciousness enters and it can experience darkness as a negative, then you can start calling things good and bad. And so I think evil, I don't think evil is just the harm we naturally experience as a result of existing in a chaotic universe. I think evil, real evil, would be something more like letting the natural harm that occurs to us as a result of living in chaos twist us to the point that we aid it in its harming of others because of how we've let it affect us. I think if there's a definition of evil, it would be aiding entropy and aiding the natural suffering that exists in the world just as a result of being here. You know, like Nietzsche says, putting one's shoulder to the plow as a nihilist and helping it along a little bit. I think that would be a definition of evil that I'd be comfortable maybe with. And I think good would maybe just be doing the opposite, even if it's only in your conception. And then as you learn and as you grow, shedding and changing and growing and evolving as you learn what harm is and is not and whatever. Anyways.
Well, this is fantastic. It is so great that we are using, human beings are getting together peacefully using rational, reasonable, logical thought to address something that is subjective, possibly, that is not easily understood, that is often belief-based. So I think that this is wonderful. And I think that this sort of a discussion is really valuable for everybody to have. I'm not going to impose that upon everybody to have these discussions, but if they wish to, there's nothing but wisdom here and sensible, reasonable thoughts. So this is fantastic. Jeff, what you were saying about thinking about the gnat having possibly being somewhere different on the consciousness scale to us. It was probably about 30 years ago. I actually had a morality equation, and in the morality equation, I had a consciousness factor to try and help us figure out these questions, of what's right and wrong in these different situations with different beings. I'm going to let people know, and it's probably my background, but I don't put good and evil at opposite ends of a spectrum. I put good and bad at opposite ends of a spectrum. If I were to try to define what evil is, not that I've spent much time over it, and I think, again, it's subjective because people use different definitions to describe what evil is. But for me, evil involves having an intent to do something bad. People are doing bad deliberately, and I think to make it evil, they're probably doing it with some kind of enthusiasm or enjoyment, not just accidentally. If you accidentally hurt somebody, even if it's results in their death, I don't think that's evil necessarily. The opposite of bad, I would say, is doing. Sorry, I wrote that down wrong. If I were to go with an opposite of evil, I wouldn't be calling it good. I'm not sure there is a word, but it is basically doing good deliberately and with enthusiasm.
Yeah.
What do I mean by good and bad personally? Well, I agree with everything you're saying, and Aaron, your example of the snake and the bird, I also use examples of a wolf catching a deer or something in nature, and I think the way to one subjective way of approaching some level of understanding with the words good and bad is to say good for who, bad for who,
right?
Because you can isolate that, and the snake eating the bird is good for the snake. The bird being eaten is bad for the bird. And so you get a situation where good is dependent, good and bad are dependent on who is on different sides of the action. And I think that's helpful for people to understand that there isn't always, in a situation, an absolute good, an absolute bad. Absolute good would be good for everybody, an action that is good for everybody. And I really find it hard to come up with examples of an absolute good. Like you say, you walk across the grass and you're going to kill a few insects at least. You scratch your face, you're probably going to kill some of those little mite things that live in your eyelashes and stuff.
Oh, no.
You know. Sorry if that's a nasty thought for people to think about. Even just sort of smiling. If I give somebody a smile here, I know there are people out there in the world who hate me, who it's bad for them that I'm happy.
Yeah.
Bad for them that I'm alive. You know, you can't. It's very hard to do an absolutely good thing. So how does this help us? Well, what I think is that we need to look to a slightly more intellectually evolved concept in order to know what we're really looking for is how do we figure out what decision to make, not whether it's good or bad, but what decision should we make, because the words I use, the decision is right or wrong. And sometimes the right decision is, well, most of the time, making the right decision is not good for everybody. Sometimes, you know, you do have to make a decision that people might describe as the lesser of two evils. Being able to determine what is right and what is wrong relies on us having some whether it's conscious or unconscious or conscious or subconscious principles to base that decision of rightness and wrongness upon. Now, I know that we haven't discussed this in advance, so I apologize if I'm throwing things at you that are requiring deep, sudden thought. But do either of you want to take a stab at explaining how you determine what is right and what is wrong? How do you make that decision on whether to save the snake or the birds?
Yeah, I think if you use something, I think we are going to typically err on the side of it, unless of course one enjoys suffering. I think one is in a situation like that, we are going to naturally tend towards, we want to stop the birds from suffering above, I want the snake to eat, you know? And I think that in some ways goes to the trolley problem, maybe even perhaps, you know, that if you know the trolley problem, and it's been a few years since I've used it, but I mean, like, so there's a train going down a set of tracks, and how does it go? There's if you let the train go down this set of tracks, it's going to kill, I don't know, let's just say like 5 people. But if you pull the lever and divert it this way, maybe it's going to kill 1, you know, and so you're going to reduce suffering a little bit. You know, would you spare 4 lives? Or, yeah, and then still have it result in 1 lost, even if it required you pulling that lever? Most people, when asked that question, say, yeah, because even though there is still life lost, you're reducing suffering. Ultimately, less people suffer, even though 1 still does. And then the other illustration is, imagine you're walking over a footbridge, and how does this one go? There's a train or something underneath you, and it's going to, I can't remember exactly how it works, but let's just say it's going to kill the same amount of people as it would kill if you pulled the switch and diverted it. But there's a larger individual that you can push from the footbridge that'll stop the train from hitting these 5. Would you sacrifice that one person by pushing him, you know what I mean, and to save these other 5 lives? And most people then say, hell no, I'm not going to push someone from a bridge, but they would pull a lever. And it comes down to an unwillingness to, like, you're still causing, it's like you're accidentally causing the harm when you pull the switch, you know what I mean? It's like, it's the way somebody might not be able to go around literally physically killing rodents, but they'll set a trap and go to sleep and not think about it, you know, because you're not consciously harming, you're just kind of setting the trap and going to bed. So I think in our minds, there is that if we have to directly cause harm, we're less likely to do it. And so I think in a situation like the snake and the birds, we're going to probably err on the side of causing, even though we know ultimately we're going to be, even if we think about it too hard, we might be causing a snake to go without a meal that day. We ultimately are going to err on the side of not seeing the birds be physically harmed if we can. I think for most people, that's what we would tend towards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about this a lot, Rupert. So it's not, it's not a fresh question for me.
Yeah. Eggs in the cookie dough for me too. Still, I admit it. Yeah.
But and the reason I think about it a lot is because for me, like when you tell your story and you only told a snippet. So, but what I heard from you was, I grew up in a religious home. I went to college. I took a physics course, or that was my preferred track of study. And I was learning logical, good answers over here. And then I'm asking my religious leaders and they're saying, that's the devil speaking through you. And so I think there is and again, I'm coming at this as a mental health professional, so I can't help it. But that's developmentally on target. And I think for a lot of people, myself included, your moral development is part of your developmental track. And what dogmatic religion does, the way I practiced it, very much as a fundamentalist, it does not require you to develop, because you take your answers from the community or from the Bible or whatever. So you don't have to think through any of these things. You don't go through a natural sort of moral development that most people would go through, having to think through these issues and develop without being told. So in a lot of ways, fundamentalist religion infantilizes us. And so I had to start thinking about these things much later in life. I had to go back and catch up. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I guess, my initial response just to the question is, I wonder how many real moral choices we face every day. And I guess that depends on one's perspective. But like I had to differentiate between values and morals, values and ethics. Values is just what's important to me, and we're all going to be different. Jeff clearly values symbol, and I'm laughing, Jeff, when you're talking, not because I think it's funny, but because I can so relate to, just your brain works a lot like my brain works. And yet I still wonder, I think it'd be fun to spend a day in your head,
I don't know, man. No.
And Rupert, clearly you value logic. You brought that to the forefront. People can value fun. People can value relationships. And so we make choices throughout our life, I think, that aligns with our values. And then, so I had to quit thinking about things in these absolute terms of good and evil, because for me, the good was always whatever the Bible said. So when I approached it from an evangelical perspective, I had to save people from hell. So going out there, I was a street preacher. I did it all, being rude to people, just whatever. That was informed by my belief that I'm getting in one's way of eternal conscious torment over here. And so that was good. You know what I mean? So I've tried to look at my decisions and my choices in the sense of what are the likely consequences of this action? If I take this action, if I make this choice, similar to what Jeff was saying, what are the consequences going to be to myself first, to my future self? If I make a decision, drugs may feel good at the moment, but if I keep doing it, I'm handing off a huge problem to my future self. Mm-hmm. So I try to think about that. And then I try to think about the people that will be most affected by the decision that I make. So if I hate my job and I quit my job and it puts financial hardship on my family, then, I try to weigh that out. So I really try to think things through rather than from a pure good, bad, right, wrong, moral perspective, more from the perspective of what are the consequences of this decision going to be. Now, I'm also very aware, something, Jeff, that you said earlier, that subconsciously I am still informed by a lot of those Christian values of loving my neighbor as myself, and wanting to, do no harm, although I don't think that's possible. Rupert, you brought that out brilliantly with the wiping my eyes or smiling or whatever. I will never think about it the same. So I guess that's how that's where I've kind of am at in this moment in my journey.
Yeah. If I can real quick, Aaron, to something you said about the way that religion infantilizes us, like the conversation we're having right now about teasing out the implications of good, bad, evil, morality. These were not conversations that were had in the religious circles I grew up in. It was just, it was black, it was white, it was good, it was evil. That's it. That's all there was to it. You were told exactly what was what. You did not think outside of those lines. There were no gradations. There were no shades of gray, certainly not 50 of them. And, there was none of that. You were told what to believe, what was good, what was bad. That was it. And as a result, one of the things I saw when I started questioning doctrines like hell, and I'm sure you experienced the same thing, when you start presenting that to people, one of the first times I really noticed how infantilized we were as a result of this certain type of religion was when people would respond with, if you take hell away from people, what's going to keep them from raping and murdering and becoming thieves?
Right.
And I remember just being like, if that's the only thing keeping you from doing that,
I had that conversation.
Terrified of you. What a terrifying person you are. That's horrifying, but it was like they never thought outside of that. They just never did. They never had the occasion to, never had the opportunity to. And so when faced with having to make a moral choice on their own, well, they were scared because that never developed. It never developed. And there's a great poem by a Sufi poet whose name it escapes me, but a female Sufi poet who said, I carry a torch in one hand and a jar of water in the other. I've come to burn down heaven and extinguish hell so that the true seeker can basically get on with life for the right reason. And, real morality kind of comes when you don't have either reward or reprisal, I think, at the forefront of your mind. I was also thinking in terms of good and evil, in terms of like how it happens to us, of always interpreting things that happen to us as either good or evil. There's the old Taoist proverb, and I might get it wrong, but it was something like a man has a horse and it's like a prize when he wins some kind of reward for this horse, and his neighbor comes and congratulates him and says, that's amazing. That's really good. And he's like, who knows if it's good or not? And then that night, some thieves break in and steal his horse, and the neighbor comes and consoles him and is like, that's terrible. And he's like, who knows if it is or not? And then the horse escapes from the bandits and returns, and the neighbor comes back and is like, that's great. And he's like, who knows if it is or not? And then his son gets on the horse, rides it, gets thrown from it and breaks his leg. And the neighbor comes back and is like, that's terrible. And he's like, who knows if it's terrible or not? The army comes through to draft young men for war, and the son gets passed over because he has a broken leg, and so doesn't go to war because of this chain of events that was always seen as it's either good or evil, good or evil. And the moral is sometimes it's not as simple as all that. Sometimes it's just not all that simple.
Yeah. Great thoughts. I'm going to put a couple of thoughts out there.
Yes.
It's just things that I think about. If in my life, through my pursuit of trying to understand reality, I had discovered that there really was a God, I would be wanting to know on what moral principles God based his moral advisements. And I wonder if I suspect that possibly a lot of religions would say, well, you shouldn't be thinking that sort of thing. You just accept what God says. But I don't think it's a bad idea to understand whatever set of moral principles that people follow in their lives, to think about why is that good? Why is that bad? Why is that right? Why is that wrong? I sometimes ask people, and this is not a new thought, I know this comes up in the Bible itself, I think, if God were to tell you to do something that goes against your own moral convictions, what would you do? And Am I right in thinking that in the Bible, basically, it says that's not for you to decide. You are supposed to. The right thing to do is to do what God.
I think you
wants.
could deduce that from certain stories, yeah. Like
Absolutely.
Abraham being told to sacrifice his son.
Yeah.
I think you could deduce that from that, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if we are going to try to make the world a better place, if we do end up deciding that putting something like peace above all other considerations, then I think it's not a bad thing for anybody that's willing to go away and really ask themselves on fundamental levels, what is more important to you, peace or doing what your belief system tells you is right?
Mm-hmm.
And really thinking about, does this feel right to you as well? I don't think that if there were a God, they would, if there was really a God who was a loving, benevolent being, I don't think that just thinking things through in a way to try and gain understanding would be that abhorrent to that entity.
Yeah. No, I agree. And even when you look even in, and we only have a few minutes left here, but even in the Old Testament, the prototype given is Israel are called God's chosen people. And Israel is Jacob, who is the one who wrestles with God and prevails. And the three patriarchs are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Abraham is the one, God says, sacrifice your son. Takes him up onto a mountain, is about ready to sacrifice him. The angel stops him, says, don't harm the boy. But then he's shown a ram in the bushes that he can sacrifice in the son's place, and God changes his name to the God who gives instead of the God who takes. And so it's almost like God's troubleshooting, like symbolically speaking, like, do I relate to humans like this? A simple, I tell you what to do and you do it. Well, that didn't work out too well, because look what you're capable of if you just do whatever you're told. So then there's Isaac, the son in the middle, who tends more towards passivity, perhaps based on that previous model. And that's not the model either. The model that God chooses in the story and says, yeah, you're the one, is Jacob, who wrestles with God and prevails. And so I think any type of faith worth having, any type of belief system worth having, what we can derive from that story is any faith, any belief system, anything worth having is one that allows for the wrestling, is one that allows for the questioning, is one that allows for the rough and tumble play that sometimes comes just as a natural result of being humans and being on the same planet with one another. And at the end of it all, we can still be like, hey, love you.
Yeah.
Or at the very least, peace be with you. If you don't say love you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Listen, we are approaching rapidly the end of this show, so I would like to thank both of you so much for being on the show. This has been a wonderful conversation, very intelligent, very peaceful. I really appreciate both of you being here. Thank you so much. If anybody wants to get in touch with you or watch your own podcast shows or anything, do you want to just throw out the names of your websites or your podcast shows?
Yeah, Aaron, go ahead, man.
Yeah, sure. I'm on Facebook and also on YouTube. Conscious Spirituality is the name of the channel that I run on YouTube, and that's it.
Yeah, I'm on Facebook. If you look me up there, you pretty much will find most of what I'm doing there. Also host of a podcast called Religionless. Also, typically on Friday nights, the 9 to 10 hour on KGRA. Andrea and I host a show called Soul School Sojourn together as well. So if you're not a regular viewer of the 9 to 10 hour show, join us for that next week and in the weeks to follow. So this has been great, guys.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I have a podcast show on KGRA called Galactic Wisdom. And in my next Galactic Wisdom show, I think I might just go through my set of moral principles that I worked out logically, subjectively, and logically. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. We would like to send our love and best wishes once again to Andrea and her family at this time. Thank you, everybody. Peace, love, and happiness to all of you.